bit about SCP, looking at SCP as a more integrative approach to dealing with sustainable consumption, to dealing with sustainable development, rather than just as a goal, but seeing it as a sort of basket that brings together all the other goals. And one way of understanding this is to look at the trajectory of sustainable development and especially within the UN system and how member states have interpreted it. Well, one of the first ways of looking at this is by looking at what happened in 2000 and in 1992 at the first Rio summit. Their SCP was declared as an overarching objective of sustainable development, and it was quite a major step because until then, things like consumption had not been heavily discussed as a sustainability problem because industrialized countries saw themselves as saw the UN system as interfering by identifying overconsumption as a problem. That has shifted from being identified as a problem, but also being seen as an overarching objective. So this is very much entrenched in the spirit of the 2030 development agenda. And in lots of ways, it is reflected in the preamble of the agenda itself. It goes on to talk about SCP as a standalone goal, especially SDGs 12. But as Charlie has said very well, he uses the word transversal. But I would say it is a cross-cutting goal. And it goes beyond that to present SCP as a means of implementation. Now, under goal 12, there's a target 1, which talks about the 10YFP. It is seen as a target, or it is positioned as a target, mostly because this is, of course, a political document. It's negotiated. It's a negotiated document by member states. But if you look at it very carefully, the way it is positioned going down is SCP is used to interpret most of the major issues that sustainability actually deals with. Charlie has shown his relationship to poverty, food security, education, energy, and most of the other goals. This slide just borrows a bit from what Charlie has already shown, and to highlight how the cross-cutting nature and the means of implementation is held by SCP. If you look at it, there was a question during the negotiation quite often of what happens if you get SCP as a standalone goal. What happens to the 10YFP here? Does that mean the 10YFP becomes subordinated to the standalone goal, or does it mean it becomes complement? Now, it's really wonderful because what has turned out is that we have a 10-year framework of programs, which is mandated in and of itself, and then we have a standalone goal for SCP, which actually very easily can be synergized with this 10-year framework of programs. In addition, we have multiple aspects which were not yet covered by the 10YFP that are covered by other goals of the SDGs, or the 2030 Development Agenda. Now, to only look at SCP within the SDGs framework would be to miss the broader picture of how SCP can contribute to a broader sustainability. There's so many programs and initiatives that are going on, dealing with food security. We have the Sustainable Energy for All initiative dealing with energy. We have the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity under the Convention for Biodiversity, which is addressing SCP. Under hazardous waste, we have the Basel Convention on Control of Transboundary Hazardous Waste. And we have the Forest Principles. I could name a host of these kind of initiatives and global programs that are already addressing SCP. The interesting thing now becomes how do we bring them together under one framework? And I will not necessarily say under the framework of the 10YFP or the framework of the SDGs, but how do we use SCP as a broader concept or as a bigger basket that holds most of these very complementary aspects, socially, environmentally, and economically. What I will try to look at is one area that was heavily contested during the negotiations in the next few slides. The idea that of whether SCP is only relevant to developing or developed countries. This question, in a sense, had been answered politically way back in 1992 when national governments agreed to a multi-pronged approach. The idea being that if you look at some countries, they're over consuming, and in certain countries, they're under consuming. It might be wrong to use one broad strategy to address both of this. Now, this idea of a north-south divide, to start with, is become a bit of fiction nowadays because you have in southern countries over consumers or the so-called new consumer class, which is consuming as much as some countries in the industrialized areas. And you also have poverty, for example, in urban slums in some industrialized countries. So the world is moving in a direction where the categorical north-south divide is no longer very true. However, if you look at broader patterns, it is more likely that differences still emerge between how southern countries operate and how northern countries operate. One of the primary ones being in terms of equity among populations and sort of equal access to ecological resources to well-being. Another one is to look at the fairness in distribution, and if you look at it from a historical perspective, who bears the burden, who actually is responsible for most of the problem. This, again, political angles from which people approach the issue of SCP during the negotiation. And one of the last one, which was heavily discussed when the means of implementation came on the table, was the sort of differences in terms of capacities. Most industrialized countries being asked to take the lead, and industrializing countries receiving SCP as an opportunity for additional financing, so to say. So, there is a very strong reality in these 3 points, but there is also the tendency to use them for towards more political objectives when you get governments coming together trying to negotiate one common document. Now, what has become very critical as this document has been adopted and the attitudes of countries showed was that in order to legitimize this agenda, the SDGs must apply both to developed and developing. In this sense, it will be a mistake and it would almost delegitimize SCP within the SDGs if only industrializing countries are being addressed, for example, through funding and so on. And industrialized countries think their role is just to increase foreign aid or to redirect ODA. There must be efforts in industrialized countries where overconsumption is taking place to reduce levels of material consumption. And in developing countries or in areas of developed countries that where underconsumption still exists or poverty, there should be efforts to sort of increase levels of consumption, or at least more specifically, the quality of consumption to make sure people can meet their basic needs and to have a life of health and dignity. Now, I've talked a bit about SCP as a broad-ranging area, but and more specifically of SCP within the SDGs and SCP under the 10-year framework of programs. When I talk about integration, how can we perceive this? How can we visualize integration going forward? And what I've done is try to come up with 3 levels of integration here. One of the first things we need to do is to carefully go through the documents and try to synergize the main themes that are being handled. Themes like poverty, themes like hunger, themes like procurement, food, energy, and so on. The broad objectives that are being handled by these 2 frameworks need to somehow be synergized. The second level here, after synergizing these broader objectives, is to look at the frameworks that are being used in addressing them, in monitoring, and in reporting. This is quite important because many governments are already overburdened. Focal points are complaining about the amount of work that they're responsible for. Increasing number of meetings, the SDG scheduling meetings, the SCP 10YFP scheduling meetings. It's very difficult to get people this much divided attention over one theme, even one as broad as the SCP. So there is a need to make sure that there's a common reporting framework and a monitoring system to bring these 2 frameworks together. And the last one, Charlie has talked a lot about indicators, and I'm very happy that Charlie didn't limit this exclusively to the SDGs. There's a need to make sure that the indicators that are being used for the 10YFP also contribute to the larger objectives of the And this, in a sense, as I mentioned at the beginning, is easily perceived by examining the two documents. On the one hand, the broad thematic objectives of the SDGs, the common activities that have been highlighted, and the common frameworks can be seen, in a sense, already being done or already being initiated under the 10-year framework of programs. If you look at if you juxtapose the programs that are already existing under the 10 YFP, there's sustainable buildings and construction, there's sustainable public procurement, consumer information, there's sustainable lifestyles and education, sustainable tourism, there's sustainable food systems. If you look at this very carefully, you can do a juxtaposition of each one of these programs with some of the goals and targets under the SDGs framework. So there's a certain degree of consciousness already of the need for integration going forward. And I would like to spend a little bit more time on the next two slides saying what governments need to do going forward. This is really just broad. We can go talk about the technical details later. But I thought I should highlight first, at a national level, what governments can do for themselves and how, at a broader regional level, uh, multiple countries with similarities and common experiences could come together to develop frameworks that help define their experiences towards meeting the goals going forward. And at a national level, one of the very important things is to start with national assessments of SCP. This is in terms of the themes that are being covered, say energy, for example, which almost every government is using, the programs that governments are putting in place, and the financing mechanisms. So there's a need to really assess this to see whether there is compatibility with the overall objectives of the two frameworks. The next one, for countries that already have national SCP strategies, there is a need to revise these strategies and to make sure that aspects of SCP within the SDGs are already fully integrated within these strategies. For countries that don't have specific national sustainable consumption and production strategies, almost every country by now has a national sustainable development strategy, and it has elements of SCP embedded in it, even if they're not called SCP as such. You find them in the form of energy, you find them in the form of water, you find them in the form of food security, and so on. There's a need to revise these strategies and make sure that they reflect the common objectives in YFP and the SDGs. I'm getting a complaint that the volume is too low, and I really apologize for that. I'm trying to adjust it here, but it doesn't seem to be making too much. Try to speak louder. Hopefully this goes better. And someone asked a question about whether governments need to how it can be coordinated, and I think one of the good ways of looking at this is reviewing which agencies are handling SCP. There's been a huge mistake that SCP has been relegated just to ministries of environment in most countries, which is a bit unfair because SCP entails more than just the environment. There are social aspects in consumption and production that are not necessarily covered by the ministries of environment. But even more, ministries of environment in most countries, if you have to face it, are not necessarily the strongest ministries, and they don't have the strongest agencies under them that can cover most of the aspects that are under SCP. So there's a need to review the coordinating agencies here and to make sure that national planning commissions are a part of this. Ministries of finance and the way national projects are financed are working together with this. The ministries of economy are dealing with this, and that the ministries of health, education, and ministries responsible for natural resources, a sort of a central planning unit that brings together social, environmental, and economic aspects or agencies to work together towards realizing the common objectives of SCP. Not only so, when such an agency or a coordinating unit has been established, this should be positioned not just at the level of ministries, because then other ministries might undermine it. It needs to be moved higher above individual ministries, say at the level of the Prime Minister's office or under the President. One of the reasons why this is important, and we've seen this in countries where SCP is very effective, is that when you get, say, the Ministry of Environment try to tell the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Economy what to do, they easily I would the word that comes to my mind is dismissed. They get dismissed, but I don't think that that's a very sensitive word here. But it's the reality of what happened. So, in order to get some kind of authority to communicate and coordinate with these various agencies, it is important to move whichever coordinating agency is responsible for this up the ladder of authority within the government. And last but not least, Charlie has talked very extensively about the need for quality data collection and analysis, and for setting up science policy interfaces that can help governments to make sure that they don't just have knee-jerk sort of policies that are not based on reality, but there's a sort of a clear assessment and science behind how they design policies to address all the challenges. The next one, and a bit more specific to Asia, here I've looked at some of the activities in the region. I've looked at some of the institutions in the region. I've looked at how they participated during the negotiations for the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are a couple of recommendations here which they might be specific to Asia, but I think most other regions, if they look very carefully, they would identify this kind of organizations or government setup for themselves. One of the first one I highlight is the Asia Pacific Roadmap for the 10YFP. This is the roadmap that was facilitated primarily through Switch Asia and the API SCP, and to help member states and the region to fulfill to meet the objectives of the 10YFP. But now that we have an SDGs framework and it's quite robust, it represents quite a lot of what SCP stands for. There's perhaps a need to go back, look at this roadmap, review it, and see whether there are elements of the SDGs that are not properly reflected here. But also to understand after the first 2 years of implementation of the 10YFP, whether there's a need to readjust here somehow. One of the other things is, thankfully, this is being hosted by Switch Asia, but there's also the Asian Development Bank that is financing lots of activities on cities, on health, on infrastructure, and there's no coordinated common agenda here that brings together Switch Asia, the Asian Development Bank, GIZ, JICA from Japan, and so on. One of the things to do to make sure that resources are not being spent or in areas that are not of primary importance to countries and populations is that there should be a synergized agenda that brings together these major financing agencies, and that puts together objectives in a way that incrementally these organizations can talk to each other to make sure that almost all the areas are covered, not just the sexy ones and the others are left uncovered. The next one is to look at the role of the ASEAN SCP Forum, which was adopted, I think, last year, and to see how it can support member states in capacity building, in exchanging experiences, and to work with the Secretariat in terms of monitoring and implementation of the regional SCP roadmap that has been revamped to reflect both the 10-year framework programs and the SDGs. And like most regions, there's an Asia Pacific Roundtable for Sustainable Consumption and Production, which holds about every 18 months, so to say. Perhaps now that we have very strong frameworks, a roadmap, the SDGs, the 10YFP, to go back and look at how this roundtable is organized, primarily as a sort of a science policy interface, but also structured in a way that it has cycles looking at policy cycles and reporting cycles, but also then moving on to review cycles. If we structure this in a way that every other year countries report on what they've done, and then there's a sort of review of the objectives and how whatever modification is needed going forward, it becomes a learning process, and it becomes a platform where countries come together to build on what they're achieving at the various national levels, but also how they can sort of work together to borrow from other countries or to influence the way other countries work. And there is also the secretariat of the ASEAN SCP Forum, and which can work together with the API SCP to make sure that they coordinate among member states and with various think tanks to look at monitoring production of reports at a regional level in a way that they reflect the regional characteristics and the interests of the member states, but also the participation of civil society here. And the last one, but not the least one, here is the very important need of robust science and data. Now, uh, most regions have a sort of environment agency that serves their member states. Unfortunately, that does not yet exist for the Asia Pacific region. Charlie talked about setting up a sort of a trust fund for regional statistics. In fact, that is very much welcome. But maybe we should go a little bit beyond that and look at the possibility of an Asian environment agency that deals not necessarily just with environmental issues, but with broader sustainability issues. So looking at the data, looking at the science that supports policy, looking at national implementation, and looking at broader changes within the region to continuously advise governments and the regional institutions. One of the last things I am going to show is a sort of framework that we've been using for governments to reflect on how they're designing national policies on SCP. It embodies some of the preconditions that have to be in place if you want to realize sustainable consumption and production objectives in any country. One of them is to look at the attitudes of the stakeholders. And in terms of attitudes, this is shaped pretty much by the values the stakeholders have, not just consumers as such, but also producers, also policymakers, but also institutions, religious institutions, cultural institutions, and so on. What really shapes their values, what sort of knowledge they have, what sort of understanding they have on sustainable consumption and production, and what attitudes they bring when you're discussing SCP within the 10YFP and the SDGs. The next one is just having the right attitude is not enough. We need to be able to translate these attitudes into very concrete action. This is why we have a need for facilitators, something that provides either incentives to move forward to do the right thing or constraints, things that stop stakeholders from engaging in unsustainable behavior. This can be reflected through laws and policies, administrative procedures, pricing, for example, and sort of cultural norms that are allowed or disallowed in society. And the last one looks at the role of infrastructure. It's very difficult to talk about sustainable consumption, for example, if there are no sustainable products. That way, people only end up having to consume unsustainable products. So we need sort of more sustainable systems of provisions for utilities, for example. Physical infrastructure that is sustainable and that makes it easier to participate in a more sustainable society. That is avoids lock-in effect, that are efficient, and that sort of build a culture of sustainability amongst and between the various stakeholders. I am going to stop here for now, and if there are any questions, I apologize if you could not understand, you could not hear me very clearly at the beginning, but I hope you can hear me now. I'm open to it.